Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to another fun LinkedIn Live. I've got some extra special guests here. I'm going to go through and introduce everyone in a second, but super excited for this one. Going to be really fun bringing some nonprofit storytelling to all our nonprofits that we support. And I've got some specialist experts here today. So just going to throw in quick. I'm Tasha, part of Team Yibu, and we empower nonprofits to lead with digital, and that's everything from online fundraising to digital advertising to technology. So it's quite wide ranging, and we're super excited to be joined by some other nonprofit marketing and fundraising experts. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but first we've got Charlotte Field here. I'm going to let her chat about what she does as part of her work.
I was like, is it going to be me or Kirk? Which
I
way is
know.
it going to go?
Who's first? Who's first?
Flip a coin.
Yeah.
Roll the dice. Hi, everybody. My name is Charlotte Field. I'm a partner at GoodWorks. We are a fundraising consultancy based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And we specialize in direct mail and digital fundraising programs and also in legacy fundraising. So that's kind of the world that I operate in. Is building integrated programs, developing custom strategies, and more than anything else, getting mail campaigns in the mail and ad campaigns on the Facebooks and the Googles, and emails in the inbox, I suppose. I'm also currently, you can't see this right now, but I'm 9 months pregnant. And I feel that I have to say it as a caveat. If you're like, she seems like she's not at her best, that's why.
I don't know. I think we're all pretty impressed that this all came together and you're willing to sit here and do this. So I think it's fantastic. It's great. All right. So Charlotte, and then also joined by Kirk. And Kirk, tell us what you do because it's pretty specialized. Kirk's throwing out awesome LinkedIn posts all the time that blow my mind. So
My name is Kirk Schmidt. I am a fundraising operations and fundraising optimization expert. So I focus mostly on metrics. As you can see, like math is my thing. I have a mathematics degree. So when I entered fundraising, I looked at it very much from that lens, but I also do a lot of the operational work. So I have run stewardship teams. I've run annual giving teams. Basically anything that happens to do with like centralized operations of fundraising, where it's not really that individual like major gift, plan giving, that relationship fundraising. That's what I specialize in, is that operational component.
awesome. That's great. Yeah. And Kirk's got a great following on LinkedIn if you're not already following along with everything that he does there. So this is really fun because we kind of had a great way that this all came together, this conversation. So I just kind of pulled out a little bit of our hilarious LinkedIn back and forth. But basically, we all have a love of Dungeons and Dragons, which we didn't know prior to me posting about playing Dungeons and Dragons with my kids. And so I kind of threw up a post. I think there's lots to be learned from Dungeons and Dragons. It's been around since 1974. Was always the biggest role playing game in the world. I don't know if we can still say that because I don't have the exact current stats, but it was and has been in the past. And so we all kind of connected on this where, Kirk threw in a message first and then said that you guys were supposed to do this incredible talk that COVID destroyed. And yeah, the back and forth just led to this. Oh my goodness, we should really talk about this being a real piece of work. And so this isn't the entire talk that was planned, but I think it's going to be fun and hopefully quick takeaways that nonprofits can bring to their storytelling because Dungeons and Dragons is incredible. And yeah, I'm still, I think, comparatively, I've never been a dungeon master myself. I've always been a player. But, I think you guys should throw in a little bit of your past experience too, just because I think Dungeons and Dragons is something not everybody knows about, but clearly is influencing your work in the nonprofit space as well. So, Charlotte, why don't you take us first, your D&D kind of past a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I have been on both sides of the screen. So I have run my own campaigns. I have been a player in campaigns. Um, so I have, fairly extensive experience on both sides of the table. I'm a pre-built module kind of gal. Props to all my homebrews out there, but I don't have the energy or the time. So I'm very happy to read a book and then run with it. But that's usually the world that I am in. I would say I play in more games than I run at this point, and I typically play casters because I really like Magic. Although right now I'm playing a Way of Mercy monk in a campaign, and it's really fun to literally punch someone back to life. That is super cool. I love that mechanic. So that is the world I'm in. I've been doing this. I've been in playing D&D for like 6 or 7 years, so relatively new on the timeline. But yeah, that's me. And I met Kirk by sitting at a table with him at NTC. That was a board game table. That's how Kirk and I met for the first time.
That's awesome. And Kirk, so your experience in the D&D world.
Yeah, so I mean I've played a number of tabletop role playing games, not just Dungeons and Dragons. So I've played things like Paranoia, which is really fun to play. I've played Shadowrun, which is a really neat system, and then Dungeons and Dragons and equivalents or things that kind of were offshoots of Dungeons and Dragons. I have been a DM. I have been a player. It's fun to be both. There's different worlds with that. I do some homebrew content. At one point, I was actually thinking, and I still think about this sometimes, that maybe it would be fun to build a module that is basically for team building, because D&D does create that type of environment. So, yeah, who knows? Maybe that'll be one of the projects I end up doing one of these days, or maybe it'll be like many of my projects and just like end up in my mind and nowhere else. But yeah, that lots of D&D experience.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. So we're going to jump in. And of course, I'm sure people on here are going, well, how does this relate to nonprofit storytelling? And there is a connection. I promise we're going to get there. So we're going to jump in first, kind of to pieces of this talk that you guys had created. And so I'm going to post the first question to Kirk, and it is, why do stories work so well for every cause? Because, I think all of us kind of know that storytelling is important, but what's the why? Why do they work?
So if we delve a little bit into neuroscience, and we won't go too far, stories activate actually more of the brain than anything else. It basically activates the entire brain. There's also a number of papers that have talked about how it releases additional chemicals like oxytocin. So there's actual brain science behind this. But even if you get away from that piece and get not even think too much about that. I mean, you think about the history of the world. There have been oral practices of storytelling as long as man has been able, or people have been able to tell stories. And so it it tends to be the thing that connects with people the most and conveys a lot of information. You even think of a lot of like fairy tales and things like that where there's lessons given. A lot of
Yeah.
those lessons are built around these stories, and so you think from even the earliest age, that is how we learn, how we connect with things, how we do things that way. So there is a lot of science to support it, but stories are really about conveying information in a way that does activate the entire brain, that does create this relationship with other people. It's also important to note, though, that not all stories do that. So it has to be a compelling story. I mean, I could start telling you stories about mathematics, and like people might gloss over. Um, so like there are specific components to it, but it is about brain activation. It is about really just how we have evolved as people in terms of what we respond to.
Awesome. I love all of that, and I do see that, frequently in communicating to others about your own experience and everything. There are people who are incredible storytellers, and they bring you know who they are, right? Really instinctively, really quickly, who's a good storyteller, because somehow in a group of people they enamor 95% of them. And how do we I don't know, not everybody has that skill, but the people who do, it's very clear and obvious. Do you have anything kind of to add to that piece, Charlotte?
Well, building on that idea that, like, yeah, we all know that person who they tell a story and you just have to listen. I think what you'll find when you like unpack what's so good about those people is they create relevance, and they make it so that you care about the story. And I think that's where we learn so much about D&D is like you don't play in a campaign you don't care about. You don't
Yeah.
show up every single week to be like, well, I don't really give a shit what happens to this character. I don't really care what happens to my PCs. Like, I don't care.
Yeah.
You care because it's relevant, there's stakes, and you're involved. And so I think that's a huge learning is like these stories, what makes them good is that they're relevant to you. You have stakes in the matter.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you said, Charlotte, with your experience so far, where you've used kind of modules and pre built stories, we don't always have to go back and start from scratch, right? Maybe your nonprofit already has kind of a great base story. Build on that, right? Like, how do you build that? How do you get people more invested in your base story that already exists? Because maybe it's not like throwing out everything and starting all over is the right answer, but um, how do you get people to be more invested in the story you've already kind of created, right? Okay, so
For sure.
it's a great start. I love that. Okay, so we're gonna go in, Charlotte. What can make storytelling hard for nonprofits?
I mean, myriad things. I think the thing I run into probably the most as a consultant is I don't often find that I have to like really sell people on the concept of storytelling. I don't often run into people who are like, that's bullshit. Like people usually are in,
Yeah.
but I hear a lot of, I don't have any stories, so I can't tell them because I don't have them. They don't exist in my organization, or they're very hard to find. Or even I work in an organization where the topic is really sensitive, mental health, homelessness, addiction, things like that. So that it's like it's a hard story to gather, and then it's a hard story to tell. So I hear that a lot is like I just literally don't have anything to say.
Mm,
The other thing I sometimes run into is like, well, I'm not a good writer or I'm not a good storyteller, and so I don't know how to tell this story that I might have. Um, and the third thing I think I run into a lot of is like, well, we've told this story, but we've told it a lot of times and it's kind of tired. So there's a lot
okay,
of
yeah.
things at play that can make storytelling feel like a big chore that everyone kind of knows they're supposed to do, but either they can't get the content to do it or they're not sure how to communicate it well. Um, I would say are the biggest things that I see people running into on the regular. Kirk, do you sort of find the same thing?
Yeah, and I find a lot of people will either be concerned about using a story of something that is sensitive or even approaching the person to put their name to a story. There's also a fear that the person's not going to like the way that a story is written a certain way. Like there is some of that comes in the approach when it comes to like things that you really can't tell individual stories. So thinking like halfway houses or anytime there's been child abuse or anything like that where you can't really say things, that sometimes it's really hard to find a place to start because you don't want to put somebody in danger or 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 effectively use somebody in a way that is not appropriate for that story. So there's also that hesitation, right?
Yeah.
And that's where there's some modern tools, like you think of like Chat GPT and its ability to take things. There are possibilities of using um like a I don't want to say a fake story, but a story inspired by numerous stories to be able to create something that isn't specific to one person and doesn't put that person in danger, but also creates, like really can convey the types of things that you do. So there are some tools to help with some of that as well.
Okay. I think that's great. And like the examples of why it's hard, and then obviously some ways to potentially get around that. It kind of ties into the next question, as like the next section we're going to talk about as well. And also, I didn't throw it out there. Apologies, everyone. If you have questions or comments or things you'd like to, these are two kind of experts in the field. Please feel free to pop those in, and we'll just kind of take them as they come too, because I know these guys have some great suggestions and have worked with a variety of agencies too, right? Or like, sorry, a variety of nonprofits as an agency and as consultants, because I think that's the piece to having somebody who's able to kind of give an outside look at a nonprofit and find the areas to find stories is it can be really challenging when you're physically working in the nonprofit to figure out how to market safely. And I mean, there's the entire piece on trauma informed storytelling, right? And trauma, like, how do you come at it from a lens where it's not exploitative and it's, it's safe. The storytelling is safe for everybody involved. I think that's really, really great. So, like I said, kind of ties right into the next question, which I was going to I believe Charlotte had some. Oh wait, no, I'm going back to Kirk on this one, I believe. But how do we get around some of these obstacles? So you kind of already mentioned something like Chat GPT, which in and of itself is kind of revolutionizing a lot of how we're doing work and marketing and ideas and creating ideas. But anything else you'd kind of recommend?
I mean, there's plenty of ways that you can approach some of these obstacles. Um, you know, like the argument that this is a tired story, it might be tired internally. It doesn't necessarily mean it's tired externally. Especially if you're doing acquisition. Acquisition, you're grabbing new people, and theoretically they haven't seen, or they've rarely seen any of these stories. So there's some opportunity there. Uh, One of the things that is always compelling is looking at something from different viewpoints. Back in I think late '90s now, there's a video game that revolutionized a number of things. It was called Half-Life, and it was a first-person shooter. But they actually created, I believe it was four different versions of that game, or there was at least three. So there was the main storyline, but there were actually two different games you could buy that were storylines of different characters within the game. It was the same game, but from different points of view. And so, like from that perspective, you can do things with different points of view and create that. I've seen like a mailing where the main mailing was from one point of view, and the reminder mailing was like from the spouse's point of view.
Oh,
And
interesting.
just like create that environment. So there's some interesting ways that you could approach that.
Okay, cool. And what about yourself, Charlotte? Sorry, I feel like I actually was supposed to send this one to you first and then Kirk. But anyways, opposite order.
Well, I'm confident we'll all survive. Yeah, like to build on that idea of like, oh, this story is tired. I always think about like, okay, when I'm running a campaign, I'm like, this plot thread couldn't be more obvious. This is so obvious. They're absolutely gonna figure it out. I've made this idiot proof. They're getting there. And then my players are all like, we're not really sure what we're supposed to do. And then conversely, I often find myself as a player sitting there being like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do next. I can see like 75 options. So it's easy to forget as the writer or the creator of the story, you bring
Sure.
so much contextual knowledge that your reader doesn't share. They don't spend every day thinking about this like you do. And the amount of stuff that you take for granted as obvious is enormous. So you're probably looking at it thinking, I don't have any stories, but like the tiniest little granule of information to you is a whole story to somebody else because you still need to set up all that context. You still need to build the world. The
Yeah.
other thing I
Love that.
often think about, like when I'm making the connection between D&D and storytelling, is like I know that there is you don't want to be cliched or tropey, but sometimes it's helpful to lean into that shared knowledge. So like if you're at the first session of a game and everyone walks into a tavern, you're like, huh, I bet I know what's going to happen next. If you've played a few role playing games, you have a good sense that, like, that's the classic starting place for many campaigns. Everyone meets in a tavern, something happens, you get contracted or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can lean onto that shared knowledge of things like that, of those tropes to help create that relevance, help people understand, oh, where does this fit? And that can make it a little bit easier too if you're having a really hard time figuring out, like, we don't have the content. It's like you probably do. You're just, a lot of it is implied or shared, and all you have to do is make it explicit, and suddenly you have created a much larger piece of content.
And jumping on that tropes idea too, one of the things I've done in D&D campaigns is I will have plenty of places where it is completely safe. There are no traps, like nothing's a surprise, and people get very comfortable in that space, and then you hit them. And so you can do that with stories. You can kind of have the like, oh, this is the typical story from this charity, this is the typical story, and then you throw something at them that is completely different, and it creates a different response. It allows people to see things from kind of a different perspective, and now they, now they go there, but it actually involves intentionally almost lulling people on a certain path until you're ready to kind of drop that on them. So there's things you can do with pacing, not just in a single letter, but even in like multiple appeals in order to create kind of the effect you want.
Cool, I like that a lot, and I think there's something to be said for what you're describing there with the idea that generationally your donors may very much be changing, right? So storytelling that you may have done over the past, if you're especially if you're like kind of a legacy nonprofit that's had a long story, right? Or donors who have been involved for 10, 15, who knows how long, that same story that you've been telling may not resonate with a new generation of donors in the same way. And I think segmentation and potentially your stories being somewhat segmented, the story that you send along, it'll be interesting to see how that influences nonprofit marketing and fundraising, because I think there is going to be something to be said for um, how those stories are going to continue, and maybe that change up in story, does it not only shake up your current donors, but does it provide a new story for your new donors that you're trying to acquire, trying to steward? Do they need new stories because they need that change up to know your nonprofit is growing and changing as well, right? The story is growing and changing. Your nonprofit story is growing and changing, and um, yeah, I just know it's a piece that there's a lot of conversations about generations and donors out there right now. Have you seen any anecdotal organizations kind of specializing their message within, segmentation?
For me, I think the place I see this popping up the most actually is in orgs that have had big mission shifts, because your OG donors probably came in on a very different version of your cause than your newer donors. So how do you speak to the people who came in because they really liked this part of your work that either you do less of, or maybe you don't do it at all? Your mission now is related, but it's not the same. And so, in a given piece of communication, either you're trying to tell a story in a couple of ways so it resonates with different value systems, or you're segmenting your communications, which frankly, I don't have tons of orgs who do. More often, I'm seeing column A where it's like, okay, I know that these are the values I need to hit on here, and I'm going to
Yeah.
hit on them, and I'm going to sort of shotgun it. It's just simpler for most organizations to do. But I do think that there's the piece of the puzzle that, like, the bar doesn't have to be so high. Like, storytelling doesn't have to be like, oh my God, you got to find a story. It's going to be really hard. Like, all you really need is like, there was a problem and here's how we solved it. Like, that's the whole story. It can be that simple.
Yeah, that's awesome. Those are it's great answers. And yeah, there's just the shift. I love how much conversation there is around storytelling, but you're right. Like, is there a base component that we're kind of almost overthinking too happening? Okay, so we're really gonna like pull this back around, and Kirk's gonna kind of lead this one. But what can nonprofits learn from those established storytelling practices? Dungeons and Dragons, 1974, still grabbing hearts in 2023, right? So, how can we take some of those components that the three of us love about a game and bring that into the nonprofit space?
I like to think of tabletop role playing as practice to a large degree. And one of the misunderstood things about Dungeons and Dragons, or a lot of tabletop role playing games, is that it's not you versus the dungeon master.
Yeah,
Because there very much is that view of and yeah, David just basically said that.
that's great. Yeah.
Um, right, you actually are generating a story together, and if you've ever been a dungeon master for any length of time, you know not to over prepare, because you will write this big elaborate story and your players will find some way around it that like negates like 10 hours worth of work. So you kind of have to work in this space of it is improv to a large degree, and so you're improvising these stories live with other people and riffing on each other, and you learn a lot of things about like how to invoke very specific imagery into people's heads. And like those are
Yeah.
the skills that come from doing these types of things, to be able to give somebody a very distinct image in their head, for them to smell something that does not exist, for them to feel the heat of a fire, of an inferno, for them to get the chill, from the dragon's roar, and knowing what is about to happen, and creating that anticipation. And a lot of those like storytelling elements that are so very important, come out so naturally in something like Dungeons and Dragons, and come out so poorly in a lot of appeal writing. Um, and it's
Absolutely.
and it's like you really are just trying to take people on this journey where they can see, they can hear, they can feel what the charity is doing, and therefore understand the importance of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I can build on that, like I think that where I see orgs fall short the most is in taking that like visceral reaction that you want to get, and then choosing to remove all the components of the story that would provoke that, which is often the problem. So it's not a super compelling ask for an adventurer to be like, well, the crime rate's fallen substantially here in Waterdeep,
Yeah.
but we would still like you to go out and slay that dragon. As opposed to, oh my God, there's a dragon fully torturing the countryside. Like we need to go help people. There's often this skew towards like minimizing the problem because either we don't want to imply that the charity's not already doing good work, or we're nervous about any number of potential outcomes. And obviously, this is separate from that idea again that Kirk talked about of like telling stories in a safe way. Obviously, you would never put anybody in danger, but it is still important to create stakes. There does have to be a problem, and you have to be willing to face it head on, be honest about it. The problem is real. The dragon is here. The dragon's not like picking some people to eat, he's eating people indiscriminately. And when
Yeah.
you lean harder into that problem, you can get to that visceral place, which is what's going to evoke reactions and ultimately donations, as opposed to, yeah, things are like pretty okay, but they could be better. That's not half as motivating as like things are super not good, and you could really make a big difference.
And some of the best story, or some of the things that people remember the most when you do any type of tabletop role playing, is when this lovely number one is rolled, right?
Yes.
Like spectacular failures, you might think that it reflects poorly on your charity, and there is the possibility that some people think less of you for a failure. But a failure, and the story of overcoming that failure, is quite often very compelling. And I mean, same with phenomenal successes, right? Like you do something that is absolutely unheard of, and a phenomenal success, it is the type of thing you remember. But those big failures can stick in people's minds a lot longer. I mean, we played a Shadowrun campaign where the demolitions expert picked up a flamethrower and tried to use it for the first time, had no skill in it whatsoever, and basically rolled the lowest thing you could do. And you can just imagine what happened, and like that story was from like 2003 when I was in university, and it still sticks in my mind. I
Still
can
talking
still
about it.
see the
Yeah.
characters in my mind, and the explosion that happens. And so understanding that when things are on wide swings, they tend to be very memorable.
And I think in many ways, things that are hard, failures, those are relatable on a human level, right? That's much more relatable than going, we got to an immediate win. Most of us have never had that, right? So we're kind of like, I don't know, do you have horseshoes up your, like how are you this person? Because I haven't been this person. I don't tend to have great luck. My luck's not necessarily outstanding. So in some ways, you're and I think that's where you're even talking about like setting the scene, Kirk. I know you gave me an example when we first chatted about a helicopter and rotor blades and the sound of what that was. Many of us can, even if we haven't spent time in a helicopter, have a good idea of what that sounds like. And it's setting this scene with words or video. who knows, right? Like according to how your appeal is and fundraising campaign is going, but it allows some piece of relatability, even if I've never been stranded on a mountaintop waiting to be rescued. I know what a helicopter kind of sounds like. So it's still finding those relatable pieces in your storytelling to bring to the table, um, so that there's a connection point, and that kind of goes all the way back around to the beginning of this conversation. That was like, why is storytelling great for every cause? Because you're building, right? You're building connections between your donor and your organization and the people that you're serving on the other side.
I think the other thing that I think about when especially when DMing is finding a good spot to end on a night,
Right.
right? If you want people to come back, you don't end with the fluffy ending all the time. You don't end at the nice place. You end where there are still stakes involved, and you need to come back to finish this. And to make sure that like stories aren't always about it doesn't have to follow the elementary school. You need a beginning, middle, and end. Like you might have a beginning and middle, and you might need a good reason to have people want to come for the end.
Yeah. This was all I kind of dreamed of and more. So you guys are fantastic. And this is kind of Carrie. Thank you. You're so sweet. And we've had a lot of fun just preparing for this talk. Honestly, it's been great. I kept being like, if this happens, this will be so fantastic. But it was, this is even more than I kind of was hoping for. So thank you both. And really, what we're hoping to do is Charlotte's got to welcome her new wonderful bundle into the world. And so, but we really hope to kind of bring potentially a part two, which was the 5 components to a great story, because you guys had this phenomenal talk that was all of the things we talked about here, and then went into what takeaways can we really functionally use. So the hope is to jig all of this and come back to um, together in the future, and hopefully at a time frame when Charlotte's ready to kind of bring this out into the world again. And but you guys are both incredible. Thank you so much, because this was really fun, and I hope there was takeaways for listeners that you guys can kind of functionally walk away from. And I'm going to kind of recap it all and send it out to the world. And I think, yeah, it's just Dungeons and Dragons is such a, little piece of the universe, but I think there is some really great storytelling components that maybe, nonprofits could look towards, and you guys are bringing it into your work already, and kind of supporting nonprofits and fundraising and marketing efforts with this. So I think it clearly does work, but maybe it's just something that most of us aren't considering.
Totally. And thank you, Tasha, for bringing it together. You totally made this happen. You were the catalyst.
Oh my goodness, you guys are so sweet. I don't know. Anyways, this was really fun. We'll be back in the future. More nonprofit storytelling, and yeah, 5 components to a great story is what we're going to focus in on next time. So thanks everyone. Thank you, world.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.